it's a sort of quixotic disorder because it is so many things, and nobody's really able to bring together whether it is a unitary thing or whether it really is kind of parallel difficulties that coexist at certain points in time. That's probably the best way to think about it at this point, because that's pretty much how it's treated. It's treated by symptom, not disorder.
There are 5 categories of deficits or difficulties that we usually talk about when we talk about a child who has a nonverbal learning disorder. The first 3 of these categories, which are motor coordination, visual-spatial concerns, and social concerns, are generally agreed upon by everyone. There are 2 additional ones that we want to talk about. The 4th being an executive function concern, and the 5th are sensory concerns. So motor coordination concerns could be fine or gross motor concerns. They could be balance problems. They could be problems with graphomotor skills, handwriting. Tying your shoes would be an example of a fine motor skill. Riding a bicycle would be an example of a gross motor skill. Visual-spatial concerns have to do with having faulty perceptions of your visual field, and these could take place in many different areas. And social perceptions, again, have to do with missing cues. Probably 70% of our communication is nonverbal, and it's quite difficult for many of our children with nonverbal learning disorders to understand whether they're standing too close to someone, speaking too loud, correctly getting the messages that they should be getting from their peers. Jack Davis and I feel very strongly that executive functions, the 4th category, is very, very commonly found in our children with nonverbal learning disorders. Executive function concerns are often things that are associated with people who have ADHD. They're problems with organization, with planning, with sequencing, with priorities, with understanding how to self-regulate, with impulse control, with basically understanding how to make the best use of your cognitive skills, how to make sure things work better. And the last category is sensory. Could be taste, touch, smell. All the different sensory areas are often areas of sensitivity for our children or adults with NVLD.
There may be some very small group of kids that may have some sort of benign tumor that's interfering with the neuropsychological processes. Otherwise, it's probably genetic and then interacting with the environment in some sort of fashion. The estimate has always been about 5 to 15% of the learning disability population, which if you calculate that out runs to about 1 in 100 kids would have symptoms consistent with a nonverbal learning disorder.
It's probably easiest for me to explain it if I take you through a developmental look at the life of a child who has NVLD. And this way we can talk about what professionals might be coming on board at each individual stage in a child's life. So let's start with, how do you even start to notice whether your child has NVLD? So you have this infant that you're madly in love with and enjoying watching them develop. You might notice that unlike your friend's children, your child is pretty sedentary. They are not starting to crawl and wander around the house. You've spent all this money to baby-proof your home, and your child hasn't stuck a single thing into the plug, which is surprising to you. So you're starting to wonder, why is my child not really so much, why are they so sedentary? Why are they not really in motion? They are, however, talking up a storm. Most of our children are really beginning to vocalize at a very, very early age, and they become quite sophisticated in their vocalizations quite early. And they can be speaking in many different languages when they're an infant, still understanding and knowing so much about the world, but they're not moving. So you're going to start to talk to your pediatrician, and your pediatrician is going to be the first person to join your team. And you might ask them, is there something wrong with my child that they're not moving around? They seem to be more clumsy. They're not as physically adept as other children that you might see. They might start to wonder about that. And they'll suggest that you have a consultation with your second team member, who will be a physical therapist or an occupational therapist. They are likely to notice some weaknesses and start your child in some kind of ongoing therapy in which they're going to be trying to strengthen their capacities to utilize their muscles and core strength. Some children are going to just grow out of this, and that might be all that needs to be done. Unfortunately, many of our children with NVLD, this is going to be the beginning of a journey for them to get help on many of the different areas that they have issues with. So we're now in first grade, kindergarten, going into second grade. You might be starting to also notice that your child is not engaging in the same kinds of play with other children, that they seem to be more isolated, they seem to not be as comfortable with children. They might be displaying some separation anxiety that is quite confusing to you. Why are they so concerned when you leave them at school? Something just isn't going to be right for you, but you probably aren't going to really quite know what this is about, and you might just think that your child's a little bit slower to develop. They might just feel a little more immature. The teacher might notice that they're having a little bit more trouble with mathematics or reading, although because the kinds of demands on them are pretty limited at that age and their great verbal memory might help them, you might not see any kind of academic issues in the lower elementary school ages. But by the time you get to about fourth grade, the teacher is likely to be indicating to you that something isn't seeming right with their learning, in particular of math. That's usually the area that we see the most trouble. And the social issues are probably starting to show up in a little bit stronger relief. You're really starting to notice that kids are not choosing to invite your child over for a play date, or they're not getting invited to the birthday party. Something is just, they're not seeming happy or regulated in the same way as other children. They might just seem a little too loud. They might not know how to give people space in a conversation. They might be too focused on their own super interested area and not notice that other kids aren't as super interested in their area as they are. So at this point, a teacher is probably going to bring to your attention that we want to talk to the learning specialist at the school. So that's the next professional that's probably going to be coming into your life, is the learning specialist at your school, saying we might want to consider having this child tested. And by that, we mean bringing on board a psychologist who specializes in assessment to really evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of your child. So there we have probably our fifth member of our team will be this psychologist who does an assessment. This is going to be a really important and helpful experience for you, because you're going to start to really understand whether or not your child has something that you're really going to need to deal with, or whether these are things that are just developmentally delayed and slow, and by fourth grade, we'll be able to really start to answer these questions.
Nonverbal learning disorders is diagnosed through a comprehensive psychological, psychoeducational, or neuropsychological assessment. Those are three different ways of sort of saying the same thing, depending upon to whom you're talking or a person's own sort of professional perspective. A number of different people can refer you for an assessment. It depends somewhat on whether you're in the public schools or private schools. In the public schools, a parent can bring it up as a concern to have an evaluation because their child is struggling. A teacher can bring it up saying that this child is struggling in my classroom and I don't know why. I'm teaching this kid like I teach everybody else and it's not sticking. The concern can come up from people outside. Pediatricians are often a frontline referral for kids who are struggling academically or socially. But it's usually, in my experience, it's usually the parent that brings it up to somebody, and then whomever they bring it up to hopefully knows enough about learning disabilities to suggest getting some sort of screening or assessment to see what might be going on for the particular child. In the public schools, typically the assessment process comes out of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and it requires a comprehensive, what they call psychoeducational evaluation. A psychoeducational evaluation includes an assessment by a school psychologist and a resource person. And then, depending upon what the concerns are, a speech and language pathologist may be involved in the assessment, and an occupational therapist may be involved in an assessment. Well, there are many tests. There are tests that look at intellectual aptitude, tests that look at neuropsychological functioning. What they all have in common is that it's done in a quiet, supportive setting, in a one-to-one situation with a professional trained to handle whatever the particular tests are. But it's not like an SAT test where you sit for 45 minutes and do whatever. It's one-to-one interaction so that the clinician can use observations from the testing process as part of understanding what's going on with a particular child. The next steps, or what do you do with this assessment, has to do, again, partly with who does it and whether it's done in the public schools or in the private sector. But essentially, what the comprehensive evaluation is supposed to provide is a broad understanding of the child's strengths and weaknesses. From the understanding of the child's strengths and weaknesses, we're supposed to decide with the parent or with the school which issues or symptoms or concerns are primary at that point in time, and how to focus or teach that child differently in those areas so that the child is more likely to have success. It's really important that since kids with NVLD can have different issues, that we make sure that we work with the schools and the parents to really develop kind of a hierarchy of interventions. So what are we going to do first? What are we going to do second? Because we don't want the kid to feel overwhelmed. The student has to feel like there are other things that are going on besides remediation in my life. So that planning needs to be very careful. And it really needs to be very thoughtful, because there's this sort of silent promise that we make to these children, which is, I'm going to ask you to do special things, and these special things are going to make life easier for you. If we don't do the special things, or we don't do them right, and life isn't made easier, we've created a situation for more disappointment for the child. And over time, if we keep missing the picture, that disappointment can build, and that's not a good thing for our kids to go through, or for any kid to go through.
Once the assessment occurs, you're going to end up with a large set of recommendations and clarity about what needs to happen for your child to deal with their particular set of strengths and weaknesses. Once we know that, we'll know whether we need to get an educational therapist on board to help us with math, with reading, with writing skills, whether we need to bring a social skills person on board to help us with psychological issues. Maybe there'll be a psychotherapist that might come on board to help us with helping the child know how to learn how to get along better with other kids, or get to feel more comfortable with what they are dealing with. There's a lot to deal with when you get this kind of information about yourself at such a young age.
One of the most important jobs that I did as an educational therapist was to assemble support teams for the students with whom I was working. Very often, because I was working with younger children, I would be the first person on board. A parent would come to me referred by their schools for outside help. That wasn't always true. Sometimes a child would have started off working with an occupational therapist or a speech and language professional. At that point, more and more people come on board to support the issues that the student is having. Those issues change over time. In middle school, the demands of the school are very different, and so the people involved would also be very different. But being part of the team is fantastic for the parents, for the students, and for the professionals involved. I would contact all of the other people that were going to be at the meeting. We would decide who was going to be the case manager I was happy to do it if that was what people wanted, or I was happy to help somebody else be designated, but I felt it was very important to know who was running the meeting and what that was going to look like. Outside of the regularly scheduled school meetings, I would often call meetings as they were needed. I spoke often with my colleagues, speech and language professionals or occupational therapists. I often spoke with them. If a parent wanted to be involved in that process, then we would set up a whole team meeting in my office and work together. So almost any kind of communication was possible. I think the most common was either email or on the phone.
Between public schools and private schools, we're really talking primarily about federal legislation. There are two sets of laws that determine intervention and eligibility for services in the public schools. There's the IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and then there's the Office of Civil Rights, Section 504, which is an accommodations package. Either of these can be used to get services in the public schools. They have different requirements or eligibility requirements. The IDEA requires that the child's intellectual abilities are higher than his academic abilities, and that there is some sort of processing or neuropsychological processing deficit that's creating that difference. So the disability is creating a functional impact, a measurable difference between what we expect the kid to be able to do and what the kid is expected to do. Meeting those criteria, then we develop the individual education plan, or the IEP, to try to decide what interventions or programs we need to bring to bear in the situation so that the child can get help and improve their functioning in those areas that they're struggling with. Section 504 is not as intervention focused, although interventions can be tied to it. Section 504 is primarily tied to, as I mentioned, accommodations. So it's things like the child has poor graphomotor skills, so can use the computer in class at all times, or can take tests orally because the student can think and present orally much better than they can in written production, or they can get extra time on tests. So those are the kind of the typical accommodations that you can get. Private schools don't need to follow those guidelines. More and more private schools do follow those guidelines, not the IDA guidelines, but the 504 guidelines. So a lot of private schools will provide accommodations to make schooling more manageable for students, but they're not required to do so. And the phrase that's usually tied to 504 is functional impairment, that there really needs to be something that's very distressing for the child that needs to be remediated or dealt with or accommodated.
School placement and deciding what kind of school is going to be the best fit for your child is really, really a tough question, partly because no perfect school exists. There are wonderful small schools that can provide occupational therapy, physical therapy, educational therapy, speech and language support, but those are very few and far between. And very often they are private schools and they're very costly. Having said that, there are wonderful schools. Moving a child from a school when you learn that there's a specific disability. Let's say in third grade, if your student is suddenly diagnosed with nonverbal learning disorder, and you look around and think, maybe I should look for a better school. It's also really important to understand that nonverbal learning disordered kids may have trouble with friendships, and you may have to balance leaving them with the friends that they know and trying to find a better school with friends that they don't know. So there's so many things to think about when you're looking at school placement. there are trained professionals who also help you to find out a good match between your student and a good school. Teachers have been trained to back up their verbal discussions, their lectures, with a tremendous amount of visual detail, whether it's graphs or charts or pictures, any kind of information. And this strategy backfires for nonverbal learning disorder students. They tend to be overwhelmed by so much visual input. They need to have a tremendous amount of verbal input instead. I think that, to me, one of the hardest parts for teachers is understanding that an unusually verbal child can also have a disability. There's always been an assumption that verbal precocity is a great indication of intelligence, understanding, and comprehension. So when you have a student who can give a great definition or use a vocabulary term accurately, teachers assume that that student understands everything, and that's simply not true with NLD students. Teachers need a tremendous amount of help in understanding what's really going on. These students are often called lazy. They're often dismissed as being oppositional. They could do it, they just don't want to do it. And helping a teacher to see that that couldn't be further from the truth is so important.
As the child goes into high school, the social pressures are really going to increase, and the issues about how to date, how to get along with other kids are going to really make it clear you're going to need some kind of psychologist or social skills person helping you. And in addition, we're going to have to start thinking about what's the best path to happiness for you. So would it be a vocational school? Would it be a college? What kind of college would be best for you if it's going to be a college? So you're going to want to have a college counselor or a vocational counselor speaking with your child to really help you figure out what's going to be the best path for you. And if it is to be college, then you'll want help figuring out the college that best suits your particular learning style and needs. Specific title of a nonverbal learning disorder is not recognized in the diagnostic manuals. There are aspects or symptoms of the nonverbal learning disorder that are recognized and could be available for payment by insurance, depending on the insurance company in your particular area. You could have a non-specific learning disorder, which you could get some coverage on, but it's very individual. Many families don't find insurance is available to help them. Depending on whether you're in a public school or a private school, it's going to make a big difference to whether you can get some services covered. Public schools are more mandated. If your child qualifies from their assessment plan, that might be a way where you can get some services covered. If you're in a private school, they are not mandated in the same way. Once your child is in college, there are different laws that are regulating whether services are mandated or not, and there might be some ways in which they can get accommodations or services. Having a passion or a hobby is the secret to success for me. Finding what actually makes the world work for you, what gives you joy, and using that hobby or passion to do everything else from is going to be really, really significant. If you can find out what you're really good at, and each of us is going to have something that we're better at, that we're good at. If you can find that, and then if you can use that to lead all the other choices about what you do in life, you're going to have a much better time. You can't only be focused on doing the things that you're difficult at. You can't spend all of your time with tutors, with therapists, with people who are making you focus on what gives you the most frustration. It's not an indulgent, it's a requirement. You should be spending as much of your time as possible doing the things that give you pleasure and make you feel good about yourself, that maintain your self-esteem and help you feel like you are not someone who's deficient. The worst thing in the world is to feel like you are only the sum of your bad parts, of your deficits and your difficulties. There are many things that you're going to be good at. Find them, use them to lead you, and learn everything else through them. If you're interested in theater, use that as your way to learn about everything else. Use it to learn about the mathematical issues related to theater. Read things connected to theater. Listen to podcasts that teach you about how theater directors got success or actors found their way. It's not an indulgence in any way to spend as much time and energy on the things that give you pleasure. I have a lot of sympathy and support for parents who are dealing with children, especially as you first learn that your child has this syndrome of a nonverbal learning disorder, because it is going to be a long haul. It's not something that a child gets over. One does not recover from having a nonverbal learning disorder. It is something that your child is going to deal with for the rest of their lives, and you will as well. Your child will become better able to deal with it. They'll learn how to best deal with it. You'll learn how to support your child to best deal with it. But we're talking about a long haul. So you need to pace yourself. You really need to be very cognizant of your own emotional needs. Make sure you have a support group. There are support groups around the country for parents of children who have this disorder, or create one if there isn't one in your neighborhood or in your area. You might want to have some therapy yourself or some coaching yourself from advocates or people who are familiar with the tasks ahead of you. You want to be really careful to be mindful of your financial resources, because this can be an expensive enterprise. There's not a lot of resources to reduce the costs. So you're going to have to pick and choose how much you give to supporting your child and how much you make sure that you're not resentful and you don't have a life that feels full and rich to yourself. So be very protective of your own self and your strengths, as well as taking care of your child.
I think that all of us who deal with students of one kind or another, whether they're specifically NLD kids, struggling learners, or neurotypical learners, we all need to know that there's help out there, that there's a tremendous amount of information that we as parents or educators can access. I think that going through this as a parent is very difficult. Assembling a team can be a tremendously beneficial part for the parents and for the students. I think parents need to remember that there's hope for their students and for them, that having a learning disability, nonverbal learning disorder, doesn't mean that a child can't be successful.